Welcome, everybody, to our webinar. This is sponsored by Jews for Secular Democracy. For those of you who aren't aware of JFASD, we are a national nonprofit that is galvanizing the Jewish community to advocate for separation of church and state. And we're so excited to have this conversation today about Christian nationalism and Tennessee public policy, and how Tennessee has really been a testing ground for Christian nationalists. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, Rabbi Joseph H. Gambiner, Community Action Project of the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, Temple Israel of Greater Orlando, Or Adam Congregation of Phoenix, Congregation Beth Adam in South Florida, Folk Shul in Philadelphia, the Secular Humanistic Jewish Circle in Tucson, the Society for Humanistic Judaism, the Workers Circle, and the Arizona Faith Network. Thank you all so much for making this possible, and for bringing folks into this conversation. And with me today, I have Gabe Rutan-Ram, Executive Director of Change Tennessee, and Rebecca Markert, who's the Vice President and Legal Director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And I'm Sarah Levin. I'm the Director of Strategy at Jews for a Secular Democracy. So I'll tell you a little bit about our speakers, and then we're going to get right into the conversation because we have lots to discuss, and we also want to leave time for questions. So please do throw your questions in the chat. Katie and Paul are going to be looking at those, so we'll make sure to clock those and answer them at the end. All right, so Rebecca Markert it serves as the Vice President and Legal Director at AU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, where she leads a team of attorneys working to protect the constitutional principle of separation between church and state. Prior to joining AU, Rebecca was the legal director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, where she built the legal department and led its team of attorneys for 15 years. So she's been at this for a really long time. Has really deep subject matter expertise. She has overseen more than 80 church state cases and coordinated and drafted amicus briefs in federal appellate courts across the country, including the U.S. Supreme Court. She is a co-host and creator of the We Dissent podcast, of which I am a huge fan and cannot highly recommend enough. The We Dissent podcast. It's a popular monthly podcast featuring secular women attorneys discussing true religious liberty and their work to keep religion and government separate. And prior to law school, Rebecca worked for then U.S. Senator Russ Feingold, both in his legislative office in D.C. and in his campaign office in Madison, Wisconsin. She received her bachelor's in political science, international relations, and German from the University of Wisconsin in 1998, and her JD from Roger Williams University School of Law in 2008. Thank you so much for being here. Gabe originally is from the North Georgia mountains. If you came early, you might have heard a little bit about that. He moved to Knoxville back in 2015, shortly after graduating from the University of Georgia with a background in media management. And moving from rural Georgia to Knoxville, he spent the next 5 years traveling around Tennessee. And during that time, he witnessed firsthand the destructive path of laissez-faire policy on rural communities and committed to do something about it. And the commitment to making a difference came home when he and his wife, Elizabeth, were denied foster and adoptive services from an organization solely for being Jewish. And that is the topic of our conversation today. So I want to start by turning it over to you, Gabe, to just tell your story. I'm sure there are folks here who have heard your story before, but for those who haven't, tell us what happened to you and your wife.
Yeah, so for a myriad of reasons, my wife and I, Liz, are unable to have biological children. And even with that, when we were still dating in college, like adoption, that was going to be kind of our way going forward to building a family. It was something that she had always wanted to do. And so then it's like, okay, well, we can't have biological kids. Perfect. We already wanted to do this. So we started the process of searching around of what to do. We knew like private adoption is a route that people can take, but it's prohibitively expensive to do. Um, and then there's also, the next thing that everyone thinks about is traditional foster care. Well, and then with traditional foster care, you run the risk of, you bring this kid into your home, you fall in love with them, you think you're gonna get to add them to your family. And then the biological parents, they're able to get their life back on track and then they get the happy ending of reunification with their family. But then, we're left heartbroken and we didn't want to run that risk as well. So Liz found this area called foster to adopt, which are children who have already had their parental rights terminated who are eligible for adoption. And so this is where the route we wanted to go. And after research, she found a group that was willing to work with us. As Jews in the South, and that especially just as Jews in general, we kind of always have this like gut feeling like the rug is going to get pulled out from under us, right? And going into this, we had that feeling because part of getting the approval to be a foster parent is having a home study. And so we knew that someone was going to come into our home and they weren't going to see a Bible on our coffee table. They were going to see a chumash. They were going to, right when they walk through the front door, they're going to see the mezuzah on the front door. I mean, there's very common Jewish iconography throughout our home. So just as a precaution with that gut feeling, like, hey, we're Jewish. Is that going to be a problem? And unfortunately, the organization reached back, emailed us back saying, thank you so much for your interest, but several years ago, our organization made the decision to only work with prospective families that share our religious belief system. Thank you, but good luck on your search. And at that point, it's I talk about we always feel like the rug can get pulled out from under us. That was it. That was a gut punch from left field. We did not see coming. Here we are trying to build our family, and give a kid who has no parents at this point, give him a loving set of parents. And to be told that we couldn't do that just because we were Jewish, um, it hurt. It took the wind out of our sails, and it took us a little bit of time to recover um, from that. So, and so that's kind of, what started everything. And doing some research, we ended up finding Americans United and, reached out to them, and it's, with them ever since. And it's, they've been phenomenal in this journey. I mean, I know we probably would not be here where we are in this battle against Christian nationalism without AUs being there to help us along the way. I think you're muted,
Of
Sarah.
course I'm muted.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm on Zoom all the time. I was just saying, thank you so much for telling your story. And also I'm so very sorry that you went through that. Nobody should experience that kind of discrimination. And so I want to turn it over to Rebecca to tell us a little bit about the case, right? So Gabe comes to Americans United. What happens then? Take us through kind of how the case progressed and up until where it stands right now.
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And I am so happy that Gabe is here and also sharing his story because I think that's really important to hear from people like him who are the victims of these policies that we're seeing come across the country. And I just wanted to note that. Um, I have my kids at home with me tonight, and I was feeding them dinner, and they asked what I was doing and why I was going to be holed up in my office this evening. And I explained your story, and they were like, "Oh, that's horrible." But then I showed them a video that Americans United put together last summer, where Gabe and his wife Liz talked about this and the impact that it had on them. And my 13-year-old son like audibly gasped when he heard that you were denied because you were Jewish. And that is the reaction that I get from a lot of people when we tell your story, because they cannot believe that this is happening in 2025. Um, One of the reasons that Americans United got involved in this is because we really believe that taxpayers should never be forced to fund religious discrimination against their neighbors, let alone against themselves. Children, obviously, who are in need of loving homes should not be denied them because these qualified prospective parents don't pass the state's religious litmus test. What happened to Gabe and Liz and the child that they tried to adopt is not only heartbreaking, and I really feel that deeply. Like, it's horrible what happened to you, Gabe. It also violates our country's commitment to religious freedom, which is a core tenet of our democracy. And I wish that I could tell you that their story is unique, but we've seen these types of stories happen over the last 5, 6 years. In fact, AU has taken at least 4 cases with similar situations, and we can imagine that there are more of these violations taking place around the country. So when taxpayer funded organizations are use religion to discriminate against prospective parents, that means that there are fewer families available to provide children with safe and loving homes. And the bottom line is, by the state allowing this type of discrimination, Tennessee is harming vulnerable children. And they're being forced to wait a longer time to find a loving home. And one of the reasons we got involved in this case too is that by allowing agencies to refuse to work with the parents who are the wrong religion, Tennessee sends the message that Jewish and other non-Christian families, or even families who are Christian but don't attend the right church, should not be treated equally. So this all started in 2020 when Tennessee passed a law that authorized taxpayer-funded foster care agencies in the state to deny services to protective families who are the wrong religion or who don't follow the agency's religious tenets. It specifically said that no child placing agency, otherwise known as a CPA, shall be required to place a child when that proposed placement would violate the agency's written religious or moral convictions. And while this law was being debated, AU and many other advocates warned the state legislators that the law clearly violated religious freedom, as outlined both in the US Constitution and in the Tennessee State Constitution. But obviously it passed anyway, 67-22 in the House and 20-6 in the Senate, despite all of that public outcry. So then we get to Gabe and his wife being denied in 2021. So we filed a lawsuit in January of 2022 in state court on their behalf, and we filed it against the Tennessee Department of Children's Services because the department is the one that is violating the state's constitution, guarantee for religious freedom and equal protection. Because they're contracting with and using taxpayer dollars to fund an agency that engages in religious discrimination, they're violating that state constitution. Gabe and Liz are not the only plaintiffs in the lawsuit. We actually have 6 Tennessee taxpayers, including 4 ministers, 2 who are Christian, 1 who's interfaith, and 1 who's UU, who also oppose their tax dollars being used to fund this discrimination. The claims in the lawsuit are, like I said, violating the Tennessee State Constitution's guarantee for religious freedom and for equal protection. We are alleging that the statute that authorizes this discrimination authorizes it by the agency who denied placement for the Rutan-Rams, and the state's funding of that institution also violates the constitutional guarantees of religious freedom and equal protection. So the first thing that happens in these lawsuits once they're filed is the defendants, the state, will file what's known as a motion to dismiss. And usually in that motion, they're asking the court to get rid of the lawsuit because they're saying that our plaintiffs, Gabe and Liz and the other clergy members, don't have standing to bring this lawsuit, that they are not the proper parties to challenge this law. And so we spent significant time going back and forth in the court about that issue in particular. Were they injured? Meaning, were they hurt by the government action? Was it caused by the Department of Children and Family Services? And is the court in the position of giving them relief that they're asking for? So is there a way for the court to make the person whole or declare the law unconstitutional or something like that? And so that went to the district court judge in June of 2022. And that panel ruled that none of our plaintiffs had standing to bring the lawsuit. So it was thrown out. And the majority opinion there said that they had no injury because the Tennessee Department of Children's Services was serving them now. And the district court ignored that they were being denied superior private agency service options and that they had stigma related to the discrimination that they faced during the situation. They further decided that the plaintiffs lacked standing as taxpayers because they didn't allege a specific illegality in the expenditure of public funds, even though the defendants had not made that argument and that the plaintiffs clearly alleged the department's funding of this agency, Holston, violated 3 clauses of the Tennessee state constitution. So we filed an appeal in July of 2022, and it took a year for that decision to come down. On August 24th, 2023, the Tennessee Court of Appeals reversed the trial court's decision, agreeing with us that Liz and Gabe and all of the other plaintiffs had the right to bring the lawsuit. The defendants then, the state, filed an application seeking review in the Tennessee State Supreme Court. But that was denied last year in May. And the case is now proceeding in federal district or in state court, in Tennessee. So we are in the process of discovery, which is where we're trying to gather all of our evidence, interview witnesses, and prepare for disposition of the case. The next step is not necessarily a trial, but instead is filing more briefs. We're going to file a motion for summary judgment where we ask the judge to decide the case based on the law. And those will be submitted probably by the end of the year. So we'll have a decision on that sometime next year. So as you have gathered, since we have been litigating this case now since 2022, litigation is very long. And so when Gabe and his wife step up to be plaintiffs, they're signing up for a longer journey. But it's really, really important that we have people to challenge these Christian nationalist policies because they go against our core principles as Americans. So again, all the thanks to Gabe and his wife and the other plaintiffs for being brave enough to stand up and say that this is an injustice and to stick with it for however long it's going to take.
Thank you for walking us through all of that. Before I ask my next question to Gabe, I did want to follow up on something you mentioned about the Tennessee law.
Right.
So if I remember correctly, there were a number of states that introduced legislation around that time specifically on that issue. And what I remember from that time was that there was a lot of the framing was around LGBTQ folks, right? That they wanted to prevent adoption and foster care agencies from having to work with same-sex couples. And so I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit, because I think secularist folks at the time, I think were really trying to highlight that this was about more than just that's not the only community that's going to be impacted. And unfortunately, I think as we saw with the, Masterpiece Cake Shop's case, like there's a reason that they choose that to talk about the LGBTQ community, because they unfortunately, I think there seems to be kind of more sympathy for some reason, even though it's still discrimination and it's just wrong. But the idea of, oh well, a Christian shouldn't have to bake a cake for, they use that narrative, and I think the idea doesn't cross folks' mind when that kind of legislation comes up, that not that this is just discrimination is discrimination on the basis of religion, right? That, like, if you can discriminate against a sex couple on the basis of religion, you can also then discriminate against Jewish people, against Muslim people, against single mothers, really whoever you want to, on the basis of religion. So I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that, especially in the context of kind of what was the discourse in 2020 when that was being passed.
Absolutely. So, and it really is, it's one of these almost dog whistles that the Christian nationalist, or that especially the white Christian nationalist movement likes to use, because yes, they're, like you said, they're attacking that LGBTQIA plus community, but they're doing it as this religious liberty, religious freedom. And as Rachel Laser always says, the First Amendment is, freedom of religion should be a shield to defend and not not a spear or a sword to attack. And because it's one of those things, you don't mess with people's religion. You don't kind of question that. That's someone's. It's a very personal, private belief. So when individuals like the Christian nationalists can, use this religious freedom phrase to, to couch their hatred in it, and, to hide that spear under this shield, it gives them the runway to pretty much do whatever they want. Because if you call at that point, if you call them out for it, no, you're not calling out the discrimination and the actual hatred that they're spewing. You're attacking their religion. Oh no, that's my, that's my Christianity, that's my Judaism, that's my insert religion. No, we're calling you out because what you're spewing is hatred. Um, and so it gets into this, where we really have to look at how they're saying it and really zone in and not let them get away with these dog whistles. And be like, no, this is what you're saying. And not try to let them use, like you said, anti, the lens right now is anti-Semitism, fighting back against anti-Semitism. But it's kind of the same, a lot of those same dog whistles where we, really have to step up and be like, no, this is what you're really saying. Leave me out of it.
Right. And that's a great segue to my next question for you, which is that, the same Christian nationalist movement that is claiming that religious entities have the religious liberty, quote unquote, to discriminate on the basis of religion, including against Jewish couples like you and Liz, they also often are the same folks using the term Judeo-Christian values, who are claiming to be on the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism. So I'm curious how you think the Jewish community can avoid being co-opted in this way. You already kind of started speaking to that.
Yeah. It's one of those gut reaction. I love slash hate that the Judeo-Christian value phrase, because it's another one of those dog whistles that are spewed out by guys like Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro, who do a really, really terrible job of following Jewish values and Christian values, which is really funny when you look at a Jew and a Christian, right? But what they're doing is that's that dog whistle to ultimately get back to, the high Roman society. And, a lot of us are pretty well educated in history. We know what Roman society was. It was, landowning men got to vote who were in power during a military empire and dictatorship. And so that's what these guys are saying when they say Judeo-Christian values. What they're really saying is we need to get back to a military dictatorship where, as a 700-acre landowner, I get to make the rules for everybody else. Forget you guys. But that's through the history lens. But through a Jewish lens, we have to ask ourselves, what are Judeo-Christian values? And I can't think of anything that really aligns those. As I was, thinking about this, because two core values of Judaism that stick out to me are also, in a sense, almost diametrically opposed to some of the Christian values that I see. And, one of those is Jews, we question absolutely everything. And Christianity, belief and faith is a core tenet of it. The belief that, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, the Holy Trinity. Jews, we have entire books arguing with each other spanning centuries because we don't know what to believe, right? We question everything. And then the other side of that, of another core tenet is, proselytization. Again, a huge part of Christianity is spreading the gospel and doing mission. And a lot of churches do amazing things with mission, bringing power and water to the most impoverished and remote areas of the world. But there is this sense of doing it through trying to spread Christianity and the gospel. Again, Jews, proselytization is one of the furthest things that we want. For folks who didn't tune in earlier, I went to a Hebrew academy. I'm from a mixed marriage. I went through a conversion process just to settle any kind of confusion. Dad's Jewish, mom's not. So like, I'm going to do the conversion just to settle the dust. At a Jewish school, I went a year of that entire campus telling me how much of a mistake I was making, and it was a terrible idea. I had 200 people telling me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. That's how badly we Jews didn't want others to come join drink our Kool-Aid. So it's kind of a funny way to look at it. But when you look at that, just the proselytization difference, and then the questioning and the difference in how we approach faith and belief, just makes me, on the surface, just disagree with the entire sentiment of Judeo-Christian values. So when that topic does come up, we immediately have to shut it down and go, okay, well, what do you mean? Because as a Jew, these are my values. And, enforce them then to defend, because we've already taken our side out of it. So now it's just Christian values. So they have to go up and defend, that hatred that they're going to spew through Christianity. And I know a ton of Christian folks, probably several on this call as well, who would fight tooth and nail to say, hey, those aren't Christian values either.
Thank you for that. I think, yeah, we certainly, I think, are aligned on that at JFASD. I just put in the chat. We actually have some resources on this. We really urge folks not to use the term Judeo-Christian for a lot of the reasons you shared. Also, it's not inclusive, right? We have a society, a pluralistic society with a lot more than just Jews and Christians. But thank you for that. That's for your perspective on that. Rebecca, I have a question for you, but I also, there were a lot of questions in the chat about the agency specifically, not just the name of it, but I guess one thing that might be helpful to clarify is, so previous to this Tennessee law passing, or I guess better to ask is was that legislation just focused on taxpayer funded adoption or CPAs? Like, where was it that private entities that were not receiving taxpayer funds or contracts could discriminate, but there was this push to allow the ones receiving the taxpayer funds to discriminate? So if you could just give a little bit more context, a lot of people are trying to better understand the entity that actually ended up discriminating.
Sure. It was a private entity that receives taxpayer dollars. And the the law that was passed in 2020 really kind of covered everything that you would expect. It covered the agencies who were placing children, and if they had objection to the placement of that child. So if a child would go to an LGBTQ home and the agency itself didn't agree with that lifestyle, then they could deny that placement. They also, in the statute, it also addressed whether those religious institutions could be excluded from a the state-funded agency, contracting with that state-funded agency because of its religious beliefs. If they went, for example, and said, we are not going to place kids in homes that do not share our faith or are LGBTQ or what have you, the state cannot say, well, you can't participate in this program or you're not an eligible CPA. So the state law actually covered both the placement of the children and whether those religious institutions could participate in the program at all. And there were a couple of other things too, but it was really the the participation in the program, I think, was part of the law in response to a case that had gone up to the Supreme Court, Fulton versus Philadelphia, where the city of Philadelphia excluded religious organizations who wanted to contract with the city to provide these types of adoption and foster care services, but openly said that they were not going to place children in homes that they didn't deem acceptable. And so I think that's part of the reason that provision of the law was in there. And then also to allow them this like religious freedom to discriminate. So it's kind of one of those like have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to participate in the program, but not follow any of the rules that other agencies would have had to if they were also part of that CPA system. You had also mentioned that there were other states around that time that were considering these types of laws. And I remember there were at least 10 states that had laws that were similar to Tennessee. And I'm just trying to pull up the list I have here. Okay, so Alabama, Kansas, Michigan, Mississippi, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Texas, and Virginia were all states that have laws that are similar to the one in Tennessee. And at the federal level, the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement is allowing faith-based agencies that it contracts with to discriminate. So it's happening at all levels of government.
Speaking of levels of government, we did actually get a question as to why the case was brought in state court and not in federal court.
So many different reasons. Probably the most obvious for everyone here is that the federal court has changed drastically. The first Trump administration saw a huge shift in what the makeup of the federal bench looked like. Trump was able to appoint 1/3 of the federal bench and also 3 Supreme Court justices. And so all of these Christian nationalist policies that we'd been warning about are now being heard by judges who were selected and appointed because they agree with those policies and laws and the goals of Christian nationalists. And so when we're taking cases, we're really going to be looking at does it make sense to bring it in federal court when we've seen this shift, not only in the makeup of the court, but the makeup of the court has shown that some of these decisions that are coming out are privileging a certain brand of Christianity over all others. And so we really thought in this particular case, the state constitution in Tennessee has similar provisions to the federal constitution, and that may in fact offer more protections. Oftentimes state constitutions will offer more protections than the federal constitution. And so there really has been a shift in a lot of different organizations to focus on state courts because of the landscape in the federal courts. That's not to say that we're completely staying out of federal court. I will say, not on this topic. We are in federal court over the posting of the 10 Commandments in public schools. That's happening in several states. We have 3 lawsuits, one in Louisiana, one in Arkansas, and one in Texas. And all of those cases were filed in federal court because we do have case precedent, federal law that says that those postings are unconstitutional. So it really depends on a lot of different factors, the makeup of the court, the case law, and which statutes or constitutions are stronger.
That makes good sense. Very unfortunate that that's the landscape, but you got to work with it. Were there any other cases targeted at Jewish couples, or were other people denied on the basis of uh, their other religious affiliations? Just curious in Tennessee, or are there? I know there were the Minnesota were plaintiffs based on being the taxpayers, where their taxpayer dollars were being used to discriminate. But are there other cases?
So there were other cases. I had mentioned that AU had at least 4 other cases. I will admit that this was before I started at AU, so I only know a little bit about them. But one was involved a Catholic woman um, in South Carolina. Because as you know, just because they identify as Christian, there are a lot of different Christian sects across the country. They don't all agree with each other, and Catholics can sometimes also be seen as the wrong sort of Christian. So that happened to our client Amy Madonna in South Carolina, and then as people had mentioned before, LGBTQ clients in Texas.
Mm. And that's actually a great segue to my next question, which is how is what's happening with this case in Tennessee impacting the rest of the country? I know you mentioned that the case in South Carolina, which it sounds like that might have been before this one, but how is this kind of echoing? What's the impact nationally?
I mean, I think the biggest thing right now is the push for these types of bills to be adopted in other states across the country. And a lot obviously has happened since the bill in Tennessee was passed in 2020. We now have a second Trump administration. And so all of the Christian nationalist policies and Project 2025, all of that is now in effect. And so we are seeing a surge of a lot of bills that would increase exemptions from anti-discrimination laws for religious institutions. We're seeing efforts to inject Christianity into our public schools through, Bible-infused curriculum and posting the Ten Commandments, putting back prayer into schools and having chaplains as volunteers in public schools. And so I really think that this case is really part and parcel of a broader strategy to inject Christian nationalism into our country. So we're playing a lot of defense right now. There's a big impact because I think they are waiting to see what happens with this case, to see if they can implement it in other parts of the country. But it's really just one prong of a multi-prong approach to gain power by Christian nationalists.
So somebody asked about whether AU might down the road ever consider settling. Is that even something that AU does in these cases, or you take it all the way?
No, that is always a possibility. So, yeah, I mean, as a lot of these cases progress, those types of conversations come up. Um, and it really depends on the case. Sometimes there's, in the case of Ten Commandments, which is like my go-to these days as an example. But if there's a monument in front of a school, for example, there's not really a good way to mediate that. And so it might be something that we need to go all the way, unless the school would agree to uh, remove the monument, we might be able to settle that. But in a case where we're really asking that a statute be invalidated, it's really hard to settle that. So that might be something that would have to go through to a judge's decision on the matter.
Right, right, because that's part of the goal is to really establish that this is a violation of the federal constitution and the state constitution, right? Um, and so I think for many of us, it's really just so shocking and unthinkable that our taxpayer dollars can be used to discriminate. But obviously, the Christian nationalists have been successful in moving us toward that world where it's very broadly permissible. So, what can policymakers do to fight back? And what can folks on this call who are activists do to fight back?
Sure. Well, I mean, I want to throw out a disclaimer that I'm not a policy wonk. Not anymore, anyway. I just had 3 brief years on the Hill with Senator Feingold a long time ago now. But I do think it's a pretty broad question. And I think the most important thing that we can do right now is storytelling. I think especially because of the legal landscape that we're in and the moment that we're in, I think it's really important for us to tell stories like Gabe and Liz's. Discrimination, like everything else, is difficult to comprehend in a vacuum. But if we start telling these stories about what it actually looks like the story of Gabe and Liz, and showing that even to my 13-year-old son, we really start to move the needle more, and really start having an impact with policymakers. When we're contextualizing the harms of Christian nationalism, that's an excellent way to convince not only policymakers, but also the public. I mean, that's another big hurdle that we have is just getting people to understand that the separation of church and state is a value and a constitutional principle that should matter to them. And so it's really important to get these stories out. It's necessary for us to explicitly remind people of the impact. And again, looking at the Ten Commandments postings in the schools, you know, we need to explain if that's viewed by a Muslim student or an atheist student, what that feels like, and make policymakers think about what that means for those kids and how exclusionary and stigmatizing and coercive it can be. Um, and I also think it's important at this time in our country's history that we are standing up and letting our elected officials know where we stand on these Christian nationalist policies that are being proposed and adopted. Um, I think if you have a personal story that you can share with your lawmaker, that's always great, but you don't have to have that. You don't have to have the story of discrimination. You can just say, this is the type of America that I would like to live in, and this is what's important to me. And they are your representatives and they're accountable to you. And so you should definitely speak up and let them know where you stand on things.
Gabe, do you have more to add around that? Just around kind of the call to action and if you don't mind also adding, what are you doing on the ground in Tennessee? Because we had some questions about what opportunities there might be to work with other groups in Tennessee on the issue.
Yeah, it's really one of those. The policy starts at the state level, unfortunately, because as we found through our organizing work, the closer a government body is to you, the bigger impact it has on your day-to-day life. I mean, your county commission are the people who are setting your property tax rates, right? And that's something that you have to deal with constantly. And so, kind of like what Rebecca was saying, is a lot of this legislation is coming at the state level. And so if, we're always constantly focused, we as a society are a lot times focused on the federal level, and the state level stuff kind of just slips under. Kind of as I was preparing for this, I went through and just going back to 2020, there's been at least one hallmark piece of Christian nationalist legislation passed in Tennessee every year. Um, so, going back to 2020, the law for us, it's House Bill 836, sponsored by Representative Rudd. In 2021, I forgot which law passed there, but in 2022, that was when we had we were one of 13 states with an abortion ban trigger following the Roe v. Wade. In 2023, that was Senate Bill 1. It's currently famous for being the transgender youth care that was just upheld by the Supreme Court. In 2024, we had an abortion trafficking bill passed by Jason Zachary, who's based here in Knoxville. What that does is if somebody helps a minor go out of state to receive an abortion, that individual can be held responsible and tried for abortion trafficking and be charged with a felony for that. And these are all laws that pass. These are laws on the books in Tennessee. And so, so that's kind of what we're dealing with, is a lot of this stuff is kind of coming in under the radar at the level that folks aren't really paying attention to. And so, so kind of the second part of that is, how do you get connected and pay attention to that? I kind of mentioned it at the top, and a lot of folks here actually found out about this call through them. Groups like Indivisible, your local AU chapter. I saw like Mirabelle Stutter from AU Nashville on here. And these local groups like this, they have folks who are just policy wonks, top to bottom, and they're going to be following your county commission meetings. They're going to be following your school board meetings. They're going to be following your state policy. And just getting connected with those to be educated. Yeah, your state ACLU chapters, exactly, Marsha. There's these organizations that through community effort and effectively mutual aid, we can crowdsource all of this legislation that's popping up and how to combat it. And again, going back to that storytelling that Rebecca talked about, we can then go into those communities and talk about, hey, did you know that this was going on here? I'll use school board again, about an hour south drive of me and from Knox County down in McMinn County, Athens, Tennessee. I'm sure we're all familiar with the local school board banning mouse from their schools. And that's something that's happening again, like the school board level, that local level that we don't really pay attention to until it's too late, unfortunately. So again, getting plugged in with those small local community groups, it can be a local grassroots group, or it can be a group with a big federal arm behind it. I mean, it's more about getting out there and getting involved and building community, because it's hard, when we organize with solidarity, it's much harder to divide us versus when we're all siloed off.
That's a really good point. And I was going to ask you, you kind of already answered it, but would you say that this experience you had, was that your entry into activism? How did that kind of impact your activism and the organizations you mentioned a few that they're involved in Tennessee now?
Uh, so my history in activism, I guess it really goes back to my kindergarten and my wee youth years. And I say the word "we" as a nice tongue in cheek. I did I did an interview with a podcast who I'm now completely blanking on the name. I terribly apologize to them for it. Uh, and I talked about, even from a small age, like you couldn't just give me a dictation and expect me to follow it. To the point where I actually ended up urinating myself in class one day out of protest, because a teacher told us we couldn't go to the bathroom, so I was going to prove a point and ruin her gym carpet. Um, didn't have any friends for the rest of kindergarten, but I made my
But you
point.
made your point.
Yes. And so there's always kind of been this like, I'm going to stick up for the little guy kind of thing. And I got involved with Change Tennessee before the adoption case because it was right in the summer with all the George Floyd protests and the COVID lockdowns. I kind of felt like, okay, I really need to do something more at this point. I've always, been socially justice inclined. I actually need to do something rather than just keep listening to podcasts because cool, I can scream into the void, but let's actually put some rubber to the road and make some change. And make some change. I got involved with change originally as kind of just a writer following state policy and writing up our little blurbs on it, and then just kept eventually taking a larger and larger role because I found an organization that resonated with me. It used issues that I cared about, and even though we didn't really know what we were doing, we cared and we set out to make a difference.
Thanks for sharing that. So lifelong activist long
Yeah.
before. Um, so you talked about putting rubber to the road. For both of you, how can our participants put that rubber to the road? Like any specific suggestions of kind of, especially if folks are kind of like, where do I start?
Yeah. Again, yeah, reach your local groups, or even start one yourself. It doesn't take much. One of the things that we're kind of focusing on here in Knoxville is community informed messaging. And, we're a super small team, but we're trying to do community informed messaging all across the state because it's a lot, what we do in Knoxville, we have different concerns of what's happening in Nashville, of what's happening in Memphis. I can't go knock on the door and give them the same spiel. It's not going to work. So what we've started doing is uh, just going out to our community and just, doing little impromptu surveys like, hey guys, we want to hear about what you think about topic X. And, with technology these days, it's really easy to throw some survey data in and kind of manipulate it in like a Excel or Google Sheets or something like that. So then we can actually go in and say, oh, wow, this community actually cares about this. We've been saying A, but really they care about G, like not even B, C, D, E, or F. Like we were this wrong in our messaging. And you can craft your message to resonate with them, but still be true to what you want to be. Um, so an example of that is, we see in Tennessee a lot of don't tread on me. So don't tread on me, don't take away my rights. Well, how do we phrase the abortion topic rather than abortion? Because as we talked about earlier with the LGBTQIA, it gets into that whole, well, you're attacking my religion. Well, okay, instead of abortion, we'll use the phrase bodily autonomy. No one can force you to do anything with your body that you don't want them to. The government can't take away your right to do something with your body. And just by going out and talking to folks and learning that that little tweak of language opened up the door to have some of those more difficult conversations with folks. And it's talking to your neighbor is what it comes down to.
Thank you for
I would,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, I agree with everything that Gabe just suggested, and then we'll have to plug Americans United here. I think you should join our organization if you haven't already. Visit our website. For a lot of these issues, we put together Know Your Rights guides so that you can use those in with your local groups. We have one that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks about religion in the public schools and what you need to know as a parent of students in our public schools and what your students can do when they see a violation come up. We also have toolkits. Last year when we had a huge toolkit on Project 2025 and how you could talk about it with your neighbors and with your elected officials. It was something that was really helpful for people when they were just like hearing about it on a podcast, but not really understanding or like not feeling really confident about going and talking about it with somebody else. So if you join our organization, we send that information out to you, and you can also find it online. And then also, obviously, it takes money to do this work, and so contributing to our organizations and other like-minded organizations, we are severely outfunded in this fight, and so it's really important that we have the people to do the work.
So to end on a positive note, because this is definitely, it's your story, Gabe, and just the fact that this even has to be litigated, that we've gotten to this point, is depressing. But we know that AU and has had successes, and we know there have been, there. So if either of you can talk about, either from a litigation standpoint, Rebecca, and from you, Gabe, just in your activism in Tennessee, what are some bright spots or successes that you could share with us?
Yeah, yeah, I can speak from seeing in Tennessee, folks are fed up. Um, and it's top to bottom, they're local, they're not feeling a lot of support from their local county governments. You know, kind of as I was listing off those laws that we're seeing at the state level, I didn't mention, our House Bill 001, the very first bill that was introduced this year was a private school voucher bill, a $7,000 no strings attached voucher bill. And people noticed that the first bill that was filed was a $450 million check to private religious schools. Like, people notice that. And they're seeing now what's happening at the federal level. Uh, you know, LA looks like a war zone at times. DC now looks like, I saw a clip today of like DEA agents just like patrolling through the park as people are going on jogs. Like, it's absolutely insane what's happening, and people are getting fed up. And I think, that frustration is boiling over into civil action, and that makes me hopeful that we're going to have that reckoning with the destructive direction that MAGA is taking us, um, in a way to bring us back to a functioning democracy.
The energy is there, and it looks like someone in the chat who's also in Tennessee said there's over 20 local groups organizing, and they take 3 to 5 actions. So they've taken 3 to 5 actions a week since April. So that's really great to hear. Rebecca, please warm us with some other successes.
Sure, sure. I mean, I do, like, you can't underestimate the energy by our groups these days. There is sort of help. It's helpful to be angry because anger inspires activism, and gets people out in the streets and helps affect change. And I am heartened to see people putting together campaigns against bills and doing protests and trying to learn more how to get more politically active and things like that. They're definitely seeing the energy that Gabe and Sarah just spoke about. And we have been seeing bills get defeated. I think there were like 37 Ten Commandments bills in 20 states over the last 2 years, and a handful of them did get passed. We saw that with the voucher bills, as Gabe mentioned too. Many of them are getting defeated because, oops, sorry, my daughter's medication alarm just went off. I apologize for that. But the a lot of these bills, when they are brought forth, and they're, especially in the referenda, when they're brought to the people are rejecting them. And that is something that I think is really encouraging. I also have to say, I've been harping on the makeup of the federal bench, and mentioned that it's difficult in some of these cases, given who the judges are and things like that, but we have been seeing wins in federal court and in state court. We just at AU got a victory in Arkansas over the Ten Commandments law that they have there, where they are requiring the Ten Commandments in every public school classroom in the state. And the judge there called out this coordinated effort to put up Ten Commandments across the country. And his phrase was like, why would they do this if they know that it's so clearly unconstitutional and illegal? 40 years ago, the Supreme Court said you can't do this. Why are they doing it now? Well, because it's part of a coordinated strategy to inject Christianity into our public schools. And so, even some judges in our courts are seeing that. And those small victories are really something that we're all holding on to as we're going through these tumultuous times.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to educate us all on this case and telling your story and giving us some positive vibes as we continue to fight Christian nationalism, fight for a secular democracy. That is our program for today. So I wanted to thank again all of our co-sponsors who were mentioned at the top of the program, but I also want to let you all know that we have a lot of events coming up. There's a lot more opportunities to engage and learn. On September 3rd, we have a webinar sponsored by our Florida initiative that explores the national implications of Christian nationalism in Florida. So we'll send out an email with the details for that tomorrow. We also have a webinar on September 16th from our Pittsburgh initiative called Confronting Religious Extremism in Medicine and Science, the First Amendment and the Fight for Facts, with world-renowned scientist Dr. Peter Hotez and DJ Kleinbaum. And stay tuned for the date for our September Call with Us program. We're doing a monthly call. It's very quick, where we train you up on how to do calls to your members of Congress if you've never done it before. We demystify it, make it super easy. We pick a different topic, a different bill every month, and then you call your senators and your representative on the spot about that bill, and we come back and we regroup, and it's a very quick and efficient and very fun way to take action with other folks. So lots of ways to learn, lots of ways to take action. If you're not already signed up for the email list, you can do that at jfasd.org, so you can get all the information about these events. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Gabe. Thank you all for being a part of Juice for a Secular Democracy, and have a great evening.